Good morning and welcome to Begin in the Word. Thank you for joining us for today's study. We're continuing to examine Luke chapter 7. We're up to verses 11 through 18 in this study. Let's read together now Luke 7, verse 11 and 12. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. Now this was the day after the healing of the centurion's servant, which we studied about that story in our previous study here at Begin in the Word. If you've not heard that yet, I encourage you to find that on our channel and go back and listen to it. But here we find him going to the village of Nain, and this was a village near the Sea of Galilee, and it was close to Capernaum, where he had healed that centurion servant. So to have a geographical sense, this is a continuation of Christ's work in that northern area there around the Sea of Galilee. We find here in the story before us that this man had died. He was this widow's only son, and they were carrying him in some sort of a procession and transporting the deceased in a casket of some type in a procession was a common practice throughout human history. We can read examples of that even from comparatively early Bible history in Genesis chapter 50, but we find the same thing later in Israel's history in 2 Samuel chapter 3. And so when we think about our customs today regarding the disposition of the dead and how we mourn the passing of loved ones, if you look at those habits from kind of a sanitized point of view, not thinking of the emotion involved, a lot of the different cultures' habits might seem odd to us. But when we look at people of the Scriptures, we find it's a normal process for people when we've lost someone that's dear to us to carry out rituals that celebrate their life and mourn their passing and cope with our grief. And the story before us is an example of that sort of thing. And that brings to our minds that what we see here is a widow woman, her husband is gone, burying her only son. Now, in the ordinary circumstance of life, it's difficult to bury a loved one, but this is not just some loved one, this is her son. And this is not just her son, this is her only son. And this is not just her only son, she's already buried her husband. So she's at a very bitterly difficult time in life. And understand that in the first century, in Roman society or in Jewish society, they did not have systemic things in place funded by the society, the government funds. They didn't have government programs that ensured that people in a destitute case like this would have a place to live and provisions for their daily needs. A lot of nations today make provisions like that in social programs. And whatever you believe about those, that's something that didn't exist in the first century. Now, in the Jewish world, they would have compassion and help people in a benevolent way, but that was voluntary individual benevolence, but they're under Roman governance, and so Rome didn't have the social programs that we're used to today. So this woman was in a very difficult state in life, and the expression of her grief in this difficulty and the loss of a son and all that goes with it is exhibited and more or less exercised in the ritual of this procession. And it's such a sad thing that the people of her village were sharing in that moment with her and following her in that procession that was a ritual sign of her grief. And Christ sees this. In verse 13 through 15, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he come and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. So Jesus had compassion on the widow. And I want to ask you to notice, When the Lord saw her, when he saw the display of her sorrow, he responded in compassion. I want you to understand, friends, that Jesus sees his children when we're hurting. He sees us when we're grieving. The Bible teaches us that Christ today is our high priest. Hebrews 4:15 assures us that we don't have a high priest who doesn't understand our sufferings. It says Christ was tempted in every point as we are, yet without sin. So Christ faced temptation. He faced trials in life. And that statement about him is an invitation to turn to him and trust him as our high priest. 1 Peter 5:7 invites us to cast all our cares upon him because he cares for us. So we understand that as our high priest, Christ cares for us. Now, that does not necessarily mean that he will always fix every problem that we wish would be fixed. In the case before us, our hearts are fixated on the idea that Christ resurrected the young man, but he didn't bring back her husband. She still had other problems in life that she had to deal with day to day. But Christ, in seeing her dire situation, did something that helped her persevere and deal with other problems that wouldn't be solved. And so Christ's compassion exhibited in this story should encourage us in our prayer life. That Christ is our compassionate high priest, and when we have problems, we can boldly come before his throne of grace and seek his help. And you know what? If it's a problem that really needs to be fixed, Jesus will take care of that. Not just because we want it so, but if it really needs to be fixed, Christ will help. But you know, there's a lot of problems that we think need to be fixed, but the needs that we think we have don't always align with our needs in reality. And sometimes life calls upon us, the Lord calls upon us to endure trials. Like the widow before us here in this story, she still had to endure the fact that her husband was gone. And so that was a trial she had to continue to endure, but the help she got from the Lord was sufficient to carry her through. And we can have that assurance that in our prayer life, as a faithful child of God, do not think that prayer is a privilege that belongs to those who live in rebellion against God. But as we live faithful for God in our prayer life, we can boldly bring our troubles before him. And if we must have the help we seek in order to carry through in life, he will give it. And in whatever case, he has compassion on us and comforts us in our suffering. Look at the reaction of people there in Luke 7, verse 16 and 17. Fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. This report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding regions. So word understandably spread about this great miracle, and observe that the crowd feared, but at the same time, they gave God the glory. You might think of fear as being a platform from which one wouldn't glorify God. They would just tremble before God. But godly fear has room for glorifying God. In Luke 5:26, we find a story where people's reaction to Christ's power and his miracles was expressed a combination of fear, and yet in that fear, glorifying God. We can have a healthy fear and an understanding of the great and ominous power of God and his great judgment against sin, but at the same time glorify God from that place of fearing God and respecting him. We can glorify him for his love for us and his willingness to help us. Now, while this is going on and the people reacting, nearby we find disciples of John. Then the disciples of John reported to him concerning all these things. So this is John the Baptist that he's talking about. And at this particular time, John was in prison. We can gather that in comparing these events to Matthew's record there in Matthew 11. We read about John being in prison during this time. And while he was in prison, it appears that John had begun to experience growing doubts about Jesus. And we'll get into that in the next study that follows the following verses here, verses 19 and 20 in particular. And so we'll talk about that at that time. But for now, we notice that as John's disciples brought him word about the miracles of Christ, that would comfort John in his tribulation. So there's a theme and a message that's rising up from this. If you're experiencing trouble in life, sometimes, troubles that are so severe that it doesn't just make you suffer, you struggle sometimes with doubt, you struggle to hold on to your faith, turn to the Word of God and the compassion of Jesus and receive the teaching that as faithful children of God in God's family, we have a compassionate high priest that cares for us. And we can, through him, speak to our God in prayer and carry to him our most bitter difficulties and grief. And trust that if we really need relief, he'll give us precisely what we need. Yes, life might call upon us to suffer, but from that suffering, we will receive from the Lord what we need to carry on faithfully in him. That's the blessing and the privilege that's promised to those that are faithful children of God. So if you're not a child of God today, I would encourage you to consider the value of becoming a follower of Jesus Christ. Think about all that we learn about his love and compassion as our high priest in his word. And I'm so glad that you joined us for today's study of the Word to discuss these things together. And as you've begun today in the Word, I pray that you'll live out today and every day in the mighty Word of God. Thank you, and God bless.